We felt very passionate about this. And I guess now I want to introduce Josh Fox. Josh was adopted by our people a number of years ago, and he was given the Blackfoot name Ikamutan. Sometimes he says it's spelled with an L, but Ikamutan, which means when Martin Eaglechild gave him the name, he who survives, because he was looking at where Josh came from, and that's how people get their Indian name. And his experiences, his grandparents, you know, the Holocaust survivors. So he gave him that name. And tonight, Marilyn walked past. Where's Marilyn? Can you just kind of stand up for a second? Marilyn is one of the activists in her community. She's from the Thunderchild First Nation. And she's been fighting this to protect their Sundance grounds from seismic, and she's in court now as well. She came tonight to listen to our presentation, to get First Nations involved, and to be informed of what's happening not only in BC and New Brunswick, but right here in this province. And she gave Josh a really beautiful pair of moccasins tonight, and he's wearing them now. So people don't ever say to walk a mile in his moccasins. Anyway, Josh, he really helped our community, and before I introduce him, I just wanted to say, because of the work we started, 3 years ago with the environmental conference, we were kind of losing hope, and because there's just a few of us, and we were up against these 4 major corporations, and our chief and council signed off agreements. And Josh came, and we met with people at the university, elders, people from the community. And what happened as a result of that, maybe it wasn't immediate, but some of the people that were involved in these agreements and these, you know, corruption, share structure, whatever, are no longer there. And also, we have a new council that are in there doing an investigation. But the nicest thing about it is some of our people in the community, because of Josh's film, I mean, these are not people who have degrees and all of that, but they are chasing the oil companies away from their lands. There's one old man that's in a wheelchair, went up to my husband and says, I told those people, you get off my land. I watched that film, and I know about fracking. So, I mean, everyone, you know, it's important that we have a voice. I just want to tell you a little bit about Josh. He's the founder and producing director of the international WOW company. He's written and directed and produced 3 feature films. He's done a lot of work in the stage, and he's based out of New York, Pennsylvania, and other areas that he calls home. And he's all over the world right now. He's, you know, they've premiered Gasland 1 and then 2, and he wrote Gasland, and he'll tell you a little bit about that. He directed, shot, and it was premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2010, and it was awarded the 2010 Special Jury Prize for Documentaries. It was nominated for an Academy Award, and I mean, we were so proud of him and his film. He was nominated for 4 Emmys for Best Documentary, and he won, I believe, some of those. Best Writing, Cinematography, and awarded the Emmy for Best Directing. I mean, that's incredible. This past year, Josh, they were awarded a Environmental Media Association Award for Best Documentary as well. And because of his activism and campaigning on the issue of gas drilling, Josh was awarded the 2010 Lennon Ono Grant for Peace by Yoko Ono. So, I give you Josh Fox.
one of those people in the world that you can just never ever turn down. I'm very glad I didn't. Being adopted into the Blood Tribe and meeting with you guys and spending time there 2 or 3 years ago was one of the most amazing experiences of my life, and I'm really looking forward to more work. So being in Canada, I thought it was suitable to do something unabashedly American. Can you kind of hear that? Is it coming through? I didn't plan to do this, but since Maud said she's chore up her speech, you know. I just recently had the honor of introducing Pete Seeger. It's very, he was playing an anti-fracking concert in upstate New York. And it was a small crowd, and they called me up and said, "Will you introduce Pete Seeger?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll introduce Pete Seeger." And he's 94 years old, and I got to meet him. He's one of the great authors of America, I think, and one of the great authors of grassroots awareness all over the world. And I said, you know, I'm going to introduce you, okay? Because you taught me so many lessons from afar. You taught me all about how you have to connect the watersheds to the cities, where he built the Clearwater, and he talked about the Hudson River, and we picked up that strand in Gasland when we started talking about the New York City watershed under the threat of frackers and how that would affect the city. And you know, so many, I think the first 6 concerts of my life I saw were Pete Seeger, and the 7th was Kiss. And I told him all this stuff, and I said, but I was planning on playing something to introduce you, and I told him what I was going to play. And he said, "Oh, that's the greatest hit song of 1814. And as if he was there, you know. And he said, "A fellow sung that song in a bar one night, and it was such a hit he had to sing it twice. And then clip-clop, on horseback at 4 miles an hour, all the way up and down the coast of the United States, it became the most popular song in America." And I'll play it now and see if you can figure it out, what it was. Time later, I'll do a Scottish one. But the interesting thing here, right, was this idea of authorship and of creation. And if a bar song can become the national anthem of the United States of America, yeah, it's my own rendition. Play ball. And then we're really just making it all up as we go along, right? And that is the power of how things move from person to person in a grassroots way. And I thought that that was an amazing thing to think about. One of the great authors of America and of the grassroots idea, Pete Seeger, talking to me about how we're actually in charge of writing the next great chapter of all of this, and that you never know what you do in a bar one night or in a room like this will end up a couple hundred years from now as the pillar of that civilization. So, you know, I don't know how many of you have seen either one of the films, but you probably know. You know that in 2008, the natural gas industry knocked on my door in the Upper Delaware Basin, part of the watershed for New York City, New Jersey, Philadelphia. Altogether, about 16 million people get clean drinking water from the area where I live. And asked if we would lease our 20 acres for this thing that nobody had ever heard of. You know the word. It begins with an F, and it's just like it sounds. To frack. And I, had no idea what was going on. And all of a sudden I started hearing about these chemicals and about these 5-acre pad sites and thousands of truck trips. And I had read about a person named Jessica Ernst in Alberta who could light her water on fire. And I tell you, I couldn't sleep for 3 weeks. I never felt more lonely or depressed or scared or isolated in my entire life than at that time. That we could see, not just in my lifetime, but in a very short period of time, a rapid industrialization of Delaware River Basin. So I went out to try to find a way to tell the story of what was happening with this thing called fracking all across the United States, and traveled, 20 or so odd states and filmed in 12 of them. And everywhere I went, it was the same story. Water contamination, air pollution, a health crisis, a sense that the fabric of life had completely dissolved and had the integrity and character of the areas that people had lived in had been destroyed. Whether I was in Pennsylvania or Colorado or Wyoming or New Mexico or Louisiana, it was the same story. But what I really, and I think there's really power in telling individual stories that are representative of thousands or millions of people. And I want to talk about grassroots because, I have toured with the first movie, Gasland, to 250 cities, even though it was on HBO in America and in Canada, and it reached an audience of millions, and it went to 30-odd countries to an audience of probably about 50 million people. I wanted to go tour because I wanted to go talk, and I wanted to meet with people and talk about what this was about and why this was important. And I've now toured with Gasland 2 to 45 cities in North America and in Europe. And I witnessed this movement. It's astounding. It's incredible. When you have 800 people in Ithaca, 900 people in Binghamton, 1,700 people in Pittsburgh for one night for a movie screening, 650 in Santa Cruz. And this goes on and on and on. You see that this is an incredibly strong movement of people who are bound together, who are concerned, who are fighting like hell. And, I was just in London addressing a conference of the oil and gas industry. The Financial Times invited me to take part in a forum. And I said yes, because I knew the gas industry would be there, and I never get invited into those rooms. And the first question was, why is there such a big movement on fracking? And I said, let me tell you the story of Guy, Arkansas. They have injection wells and fracking. They had 1,000 earthquakes in a year. I met a woman who was a dog breeder. Her name was Susan Fry. She had 100 of these little black, pure-breed snowflake dogs running around back behind her house. And she became so obsessed with tracking earthquakes that she had a plumb bob attached to the bottom of her coffee table. And every time the plumb bob moved, she would go on the earthquake tracking sites and say, see, there was another earthquake. She would sit there all day watching this thing go back and forth. So most of those quakes were small, they were microquakes. But then a 4.7 hit, put cracks in the walls of the local high school, and knocked the earthquake lady's husband out of his lazy boy. And I imagine that as he hit the ground, you know, something happened to him. Or I was telling the guys, or I can tell you the story of Amy Ellsworth in Colorado, in the Front Range, outside of Denver, whose tap water was so flammable that she could light it on fire at the tap. And she was showering in the dark because she was afraid of a spark from her light bulb would blow her up in her shower. And I imagine that when she was standing there, you know, naked, dripping, fumbling for a towel in the dark, that something happened to her. And I can tell you the story of the G family in Tioga County, Pennsylvania. Shell Oil Company installed a 6-well horizontal pad about 200 feet from their bedroom window. Their water became flammable, their pond became contaminated with all the frack runoff and was dying. And they were forced to move out of that house that they'd lived in for 5 generations, or they had been on that land for 5 generations, and sign a non-disclosure agreement, never to tell their stories ever again. Thankfully, it is in Gasland too. But I imagine as they walked away from that home and shut the door and realized that they didn't need to lock it, you know, something happened to them. Or Lois, standing there in front of those trucks, the police commissioner, about to be arrested. That continuing spirit of activism. Or the New Orleans fisherman that I just met 3 weeks ago, who said, my oyster catch is down in the Gulf of Mexico, my oyster catch is down 94%. I'm out of business. At 57 years old, I'm going back to school. And I imagine him sitting there in first class, you know, with the Gulf waters still rocking inside of him, that something probably happened to him. I can tell you 100 stories, maybe more, all of whom emblematic of what's happening all across the world, what's happening all across, certainly North America, but all across the world, that we are being invaded by this thing called extreme energy. Extreme energy is extremism from the oil and gas industry. When we have drilling and fracking in 34 states in the U.S., and I don't know how many provinces here, but probably a lot, and in 32 countries worldwide, proposals to frack. When we have frack sand mining blowing off the tops of bluffs in a handful of states where there is no fracking. We have deep water drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, mountaintop removal for coal throughout Appalachia. The Keystone Pipeline, as you know, proposed to run like a scar that won't heal right down the middle of the United States of America. And when we have superstorms emptying the Atlantic Ocean into the New York City subway system, or swamping whole towns in Vermont, 100-year-old bridges washing away in the blink of an eye. When we have typhoon after typhoon in the Philippines, historic floods in Pakistan and Australia, I could go on and on and on. There is no one outside of this target zone. There is no one who's not in the front line. We are now graduated. We're all in that frontline community. Extreme energy is a paradigm shift in energy development. Conventional oil, coal, and gas developed over the last 200 years. That supply is running out. So the oil and gas industry has shifted to unconventional sources. I like to call that extreme energy. Tar sands, which scrapes off the entire surface of the earth. The target is, one of the targets is the boreal forest in Canada, the size of the state of Florida, or You know how big it is. I don't have to use metaphor. You're Canadians. Fracking, which injects toxic material down in the ground at pressures that rival cluster bombs, with wells that crack and leak that we know, according to oil and gas industry's own literature and own science, leak at a rate of 5% immediately upon drilling and up to 50 to 60% over a 30-year period. Mountaintop removal for coal, where for once they didn't use the euphemism, they just blow off the top of the mountain. And deepwater drilling. Probably you don't know, but the Deepwater Horizon that exploded was drilling down nearly 5 miles. It was one of 12 that far out on the outer continental shelf. It was brand new technology. Extreme energy is not like, it's like you ski down a normal slope. Extreme skiing, you know, when everybody cracks their head open. It's like skiing straight down the Empire State Building. We know that extreme energy is much more toxic, much more destructive. It's inherently toxic and destructive. And that's what we're shifting, the oil and gas industry and coal industry would like the world to shift to that paradigm of extreme energy. And that means that we're experiencing the type of invasion of these companies, these multinational oil and gas companies, the most powerful, profitable corporations in the history of money, at so many of our doorsteps. And as they ratchet this plan up to keep us addicted to fossil fuels for the next 50 or 60 years, the huge and grave mounting threat of global climate change, we know we have to solve that problem in much less time. So the paradigm is extreme energy, or what the grassroots movement that's all over the world wants, which is renewable energy. The good news is that you know, renewable energy can run everything that we have a need for on the planet. We can replace all of our fossil fuel sources with renewables. We have enough wind on the planet to power the Earth 7 times over. Solar is something like 30 times. Mark Jacobson, the brilliant energy planner from Stanford, has written these plans to show how we can get off of fossil fuels and do it in a hurry. So there is no necessity for this extreme energy movement, this extremism from the oil and gas industry, other than their own profit motive. It has nothing to do with energy development for humankind. It's actually quite the opposite. But there's another form of contamination due to fracking that I want to talk about, I want to point out, which is the contamination of our forms of democratic government. Though it's, you know, at the end of Gasland 2, I used a metaphor. It's like I could see a well bore, you know, snaking down underneath the United States Congress and shooting money up through the chamber at such high pressure that it blew the top off of the democracy. And it's not just the money. $747 million spent in the United States on lobbying to reverse the to exempt fracking from our Safe Drinking Water Act, our primary groundwater protection law. They're exempt. It's cost them $750 million. But it's way beyond that. It's the influence that they have at our state regulatory commissions, within elections at the state level and within the Congress. When I asked Brad Miller, congressman from North Carolina, our first question in my interview for him in Gasland 2, says, tell me about the influence of oil and gas on Congress. And he goes, influence? Try ownership. And I said, would you care to elaborate on that? He goes, are we rolling? I said, yeah. The contamination of our forms of democracy by this industry, and the contamination of our media. In your paper today, there's a letter to the editor challenging the op-ed that Maud and I co-wrote called Celebrate Fracking, in which they state there hasn't been a single episode of water contamination due to fracking. It's printed in the paper. I want everybody in this room to call those editors tomorrow and say, how dare you? The Los Angeles Times will not print letters that feature climate change denialism. You shouldn't have a hometown paper here that prints fracking denialism. diverse and awesome and beautiful grassroots movement that I'm in awe of every day, with so many different types of strategies. From, you know, your citizen lobbying, going to the Capitol, to petition drives, to awareness drives, to bootleg copies of Gasland and hand them out to all your neighbors, to, you know, knocking on people's doors, because this is a movement of neighbors, to that communication on the social media, and I think also vitally important, as it is to every grassroots movement that's ever succeeded, direct action and nonviolent civil disobedience. And I was just in Balcom, where they had a standoff against the police for, I think, 2 months, and which they experienced a whole lot of police brutality. And I met a guy named Tigger who had de-locked himself to one of the pieces of equipment. And he described that he was wailed upon by the police and the rage that he felt, and watching people who were pepper sprayed. It's just mind-boggling to me that we have now institutionalized, to a certain degree, pepper spray as a tactic for protesters, that's okay. I can thank Mayor Mike Bloomberg, billionaire Mayor Mike Bloomberg, whose friends finance tracking, for deploying that and dispersing Occupy. But it occurs to me, and when I saw the pictures from New Brunswick, my jaw was on the floor. We were on tour. I was in Detroit. I saw this incredible photograph of a woman with an eagle feather standing in front of the line of police. And I saw snipers, military snipers in the bushes, and heard that they had been fired upon with rubber bullets and high-pressure hoses. And they sent 700 members of the police or military to a town of 818 people. That this was an insane and overzealous reaction to a peaceful protest. And it shows that there's an institutional level of racism within the RCMP and who would do it. Because I don't think it would have happened that way if this was a bunch of white grandmas out in the streets, you know. I really don't think it would have happened in the same way. I really think that there's a ratcheting up of brutality because this was the First Nations gathering that has to be called out for what it was. But I also have to make a plea for nonviolent reactions to that type of repression. I have to say that it is so important for us to remain nonviolent. I walked over to the shopping mall this afternoon, and I was completely amazed that there's a statue of Mahatma Gandhi just down the road. It's a huge statue, and it said underneath the picture, the bronze head of Gandhi in Saskatoon, "Nonviolence is a universal law." That's what it says. And as hard as it is, and as understandable as it is, and who knows what really happened, right? You know, we can't be lighting cop cars on fire. I just don't think we can. Unless we want to suffer that type of immediate degradation that happened afterward. And we have to embrace principles of nonviolence. And I would say, even if, and there have been instances of infiltration, we know of this, and of provocateurs who go in and pose as protesters, and I don't know exactly what happened over there, but you do know there's a history of that. But I would call upon us as a movement, as a grassroots movement of considerable power, that we have to recognize our power and not sink to that level, because we are much more powerful if we remain nonviolent. And I would say that we should take preemptive measures against sabotage in the future by signing a declaration of nonviolence before we do the blockade, by leaving the violence to those people who would come in with snipers and rubber bullets, and by stating at the outset, we will have none of this. Because then, if you put that out there, in writing, in the paper, then there will be no justification whatsoever for sending in anyone's mind. Not that there is, but you understand how we can undercut that. Because I'm very afraid of this. I'm watching this as a person who's, in many ways, responsible for supplying a lot of the storytelling in Emmy. And I say to myself, we have to make sure that we're trained in doing it in the ways that we don't fight back. We're fighting back in other ways. So, and I think that, what that means to me is, oil and gas industry is knowingly deceitful. They're knowingly deceitful. Their tactics are deceitful, they're aggressive. They lie to the media. They lie to our reporters. But in the face of their deceitful practice and in the face of their misinformation campaigns, I would say we have to reaffirm honesty. And in the face of their trampling of people's human rights, as happens all over where this industry goes, I think we have to reaffirm the idea of decency and neighborliness. And in the face of fragmentation of communities, I'd say we have to reaffirm the idea of trust. And in the face of their greed, I would say we have to reaffirm our ideas of kindness. Because those are the tests that they fail over and over and over again. They can be exempt from the Safe Drinking Water Act. They can be exempt from the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Superfund Act, the Clean Air Act. But you cannot be exempt from the basic laws, moral laws of human kindness, human decency, and trust. You can't. And they are guilty of violating those laws. So I take an enormous amount of inspiration and hope from this grassroots movement, and it is powerful. And I would say that if you look at it on the local level, you have thousands of people affected. If you look at it on the county-wide level, you have hundreds of thousands. When you look at it at a regional level, you have millions of people affected, right? Whether it's regional air pollution and smog, or the downstream communities outside of the frac zone that are going to be contaminated. But if you look at it from the global climate change level, it's billions of people that are affected. And it is us who are in the target zone, in our own backyards, that have the responsibility of acting right now, because we have this catalyst that came to our neighborhood that's called extreme energy. And it has pushed us forward and pushed us into a totally new kind of consciousness. It's an extreme and it's an emergency. We hit 2 degrees of warming by 2042 at current emissions levels. That means we lose, according to IPCC, 1/4 to 30% of all the plant and animal species on the planet. That's a lot of goodbyes. It also probably means the collapse of our industrial civilization. We don't have a lot of time. So it is this grassroots that is going to stand up and get in the way of that extreme energy. And I have an enormous amount of faith in it, and I'm very excited about the future, because it has led us to so many amazing meetings of people. And I hope that you continue to participate in it, and I hope that you have fun with it. And because what we're doing here is building that sense of honesty and community together. And there's nothing more important and more valuable to do in life that I've ever experienced. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Josh. I'd never heard of Josh. When Lois suggested he be a keynote speaker tonight,